Welcome back to the deep dive. We have a massive stack of documents on the virtual table today, and honestly, looking through the listener requests over the last few months, this is a topic that just comes up constantly.
It really does.
We are finally turning the dial on the time machine back to the 1980s.
The decade of excess, as they say.
Right, and that's the thing, isn't it? Usually when we talk about the 80s, the brain immediately goes to the aesthetic. We have this very specific pop culture memory of the era.
Absolutely. Neon. Big hair.
We're thinking neon nostalgia, we're thinking synth-pop, shoulder pads the size of, I don't know, aircraft carriers. Maybe the fall of the Berlin Wall is playing on a fuzzy TV in the background. It's this colorful, loud, optimistic era.
It is certainly colorful. I'll give it that. But if we peel back that layer of neon, we find something much more structural and, frankly, much more consequential for where we are today.
So we're not just here for the greatest hits.
We aren't here to talk about Ghostbusters or Madonna today, no. We are looking at what the source material we've gathered calls a systemic bifurcation.
A systemic bifurcation. Okay, let's unpack this right off the bat because that sounds intense. We're saying the 80s wasn't just a collection of political events, but something deeper.
Precisely. The central thesis of the research we're diving into today argues that the decade from 1980 to 1990 was nothing less than a thermodynamic phase transition for civilization.
A thermodynamic phase transition. Wow.
Yeah. Think of it like water turning into steam. The substance, the people, the buildings, the geography, it's all still there, but the fundamental rules of physics governing how those molecules move and interact, they change completely. The pressure and temperature are different.
That is a powerful image. So the old rules, the post-war rules, they just evaporated.
They collapsed. The 80s saw the implosion of the entire post-war order. I mean, everything that defined the world from, say, 1945 to 1979, the Keynesian economic model, the industrial factory system we call Fordism, the relative stability of the Cold War balance, all of that just collapsed under its own contradictions in the 70s.
And in its place, we didn't just get chaos. It wasn't a void. We installed a new operating system.
Exactly. A brand new operating system. And that OS is called neoliberalism. And this is where we have to be really, really careful with our definitions.
Because that word gets thrown around a lot.
It gets thrown around all the time, usually just as a synonym for capitalism I don't like, but specifically, structurally, as a technology, it means something very precise.
Right, and the biggest mythbuster for me in reading this stack of notes was about the role of the government. I think the common wisdom, the story we've all been told, is that Reagan and Thatcher came in and said, government is the problem, right?
The 9 most terrifying words.
Exactly, so they just stepped back, they let the invisible hand of the free market take the wheel, just total laissez-faire.
That is the common misconception, yes. And it's frankly, the story they told about themselves. It was very effective marketing, but the source material is absolutely adamant that this is false.
That wasn't true.
Neoliberalism wasn't a return to some natural state of free markets. It was an active, state-led reprogramming of society. It wasn't about the state withdrawing. It was about the state intervening more, but in a completely different way for a different purpose.
Okay, can you give me an example of that distinction? Because it's a tricky one to get your head around.
Well, think about it. You don't get a market in healthcare naturally, or a market in education, or, a market in carbon emissions. Those things aren't naturally commodities like wheat or iron.
Right, they're social goods or just things.
Exactly. You have to build the legal architecture to make those things tradable. You have to create property rights, enforcement mechanisms, pricing structures. It required massive juridical, administrative, and, let's be blunt, coercive intervention to create and police markets where they didn't exist before.
So it's not that the referee left the field. It's that the referee rewrote the entire rule book to favor a completely different style of play and then started handing out red cards to anyone who was still playing the old game.
And enforce those new rules with a baton.
Yeah.
That's a perfect analogy. And that's the mission of today's deep dive. We are going to deconstruct this architecture.
I like that.
We're going to look at it not as a political ideology. We aren't asking if it was good or bad in a moral sense today, but as a technology of government.
A machine.
A technology that fundamentally changed how we work, how we borrow money, how we view our own psychology, and ultimately how we treat the planet.
It changed everything.
I love that framing. A technology of government. It makes it sound like a machine we can actually take apart to see how the gears turn. So let's grab the wrench and start with the engine room.
The economy.
Let's start with the economy. The source material calls this first section the Great Decoupling.
This is This is arguably the single most important economic chart of the last 50 years. If you want to understand why the economy feels broken for so many people today, regardless of their politics, you have to look at this specific split in the data that happens right around 1980. Okay, so paint the picture for us. What was the before times, what happened before 1980, and what happened after?
Before 1980, and this holds true specifically from the end of World War II until the mid-70s, we had what felt like a synchronized pact, an unwritten social contract. If productivity went up,
Which just means workers are making more stuff per hour, right? Because
Yeah.
of better tech or better skills.
Exactly. If productivity went up, then wages for the average worker went up by roughly the same amount. The line on the graph for productivity and the line for wages, they just hugged each other tight. They moved together in lockstep.
You work harder, you make more stuff for the company, you get paid more. Simple, it seems. That seems fair.
It felt like a law of nature, but it wasn't. It was a political arrangement, an outcome of a specific balance of power secured by things like strong unions and government policy.
And after 1980,
After 1980, that pact was broken. The line split. The graph looks like a pair of open jaws. Productivity kept climbing. We got better computers, better machines, globalization, more efficiency. But the line for real wages for the median worker just flatlined.
it just went horizontal.
It went almost completely horizontal. This divergence, this massive gap that opens up, that is the Great Decoupling.
And the numbers here are just staggering. The source really highlights the difference between the US and the UK. Let's start with the US. It says there is a 63% gross decoupling. What does that even mean in real terms?
63%. It means that for every dollar of extra wealth generated by an hour of work, only 37 cents was going back to the worker in any form. The other 63 cents went somewhere else. It represents a massive amount of wealth, trillions upon trillions of dollars over the decades, that was generated by the economy but did not end up in the pockets of the people doing the work.
Wow. So the obvious forensic accounting question is, where did the money go?
Right. It didn't just vanish into thin air. The economy grew. It's not a magic trick.
That's
Someone has that money.
Someone's got the cash.
And the research we looked at identifies 3 specific vectors or channels where this money flowed. The first one is probably the one you'd expect. It's the most straightforward.
Let me guess. The rich got richer.
Inequality in compensation. Simple as that. This is the rise of what's been called the supermanager.
The era of the rock star CEO, Gordon Gekko.
Exactly. The top 1%, the top moral 0.1%, and the executive class captured the vast majority of those productivity gains. This is when we start seeing CEO pay go from being, say, 20 or 30 times the average worker's pay to 200, 300, 400 times.
Right.
So vector 1 is simply, the bosses kept it.
Okay, that fits the narrative we usually hear. But Vector 2 is a bit more technical, and frankly, it was surprising to me. It's called the benefits wedge.
This is absolutely crucial for understanding the American experience specifically. It's a huge part of the puzzle. A massive chunk of that missing money didn't go to the bosses, and it didn't go to the workers' pockets either. It went to covering the rising cost of non-wage benefits.
So things like health insurance.
Specifically, health insurance. In the U.S., the cost of employer-provided health insurance began to explode in the 1980s.
Ah, so the company is technically paying more for you, but you don't see a dime of it because it's just going straight to the insurance company to cover these skyrocketing premiums.
Exactly. The incredible inefficiency and price gouging of the privatized U.S. healthcare system acts as a hidden tax on American labor. Your productivity goes up, the company allocates more money to your total compensation package, but the insurance company swallows that increase before it ever hits your bank account.
That is incredibly frustrating. It's like you're running on a treadmill and you're running faster and faster, but the electricity bill for the treadmill keeps going up, so they take it out of your water ration. You're working harder but feeling poorer.
That's a vivid analogy, but it's dead on accurate. It explains why so many people feel like they are working harder than their parents but have less disposable income. And then we have the third vector, which is just as important, the price wedge.
The price wedge, okay.
This is the divergence between the price of the things that workers produce versus the price of the things they consume.
Break that down for me. That sounds a little abstract.
It's pretty simple when you think about it.
Yeah.
Thanks to technology and outsourcing, which we'll definitely get to, the price of consumer goods, things like televisions, clothes, toys, electronics, those prices dropped, or at least they stayed low relative to inflation. Those are the things workers in factories make.
Got it.
But the things that workers need to survive, the absolute essentials, housing, healthcare, and higher education,
Yeah.
those prices skyrocketed, growing much, much faster than general inflation.
So your wages are flat, but the cost of just having a roof over your head and sending your kid to college is going through the roof.
Precisely. You can buy a cheap flat-screen TV on credit to watch in an apartment you can no longer afford to rent.
That is the consumer condition established in the 80s.
It is. Now, if we look across the Atlantic to the UK, the flavor of this decoupling is slightly different, and it's really interesting. They had a 42.5% gross decoupling, so a bit less than the US. But there's a statistical paradox here that the expert in the source material highlights.
A paradox.
The net decoupling in the UK was near zero.
Wait, net decoupling near zero. Hold on. Does that mean British workers actually got paid their fair share in the end?
No, not at all. And this is a perfect example of how averages can lie. What it means is that capital, as a whole class of owners, didn't take a much bigger slice of the total national pie than it did back in 1970. The overall labor share of income stayed relatively stable.
So if the owners weren't taking it, where did the inequality come from?
The distribution within the workforce itself became violently unequal.
Oh, I see. So it's not just capital versus labor anymore. It's high-paid labor versus low-paid labor.
Correct. The wages at the top end, think finance, law, corporate management in the City of London, they soared into the stratosphere after the Big Bang of financial deregulation in '86. At the same time, the median and lower wages for industrial workers, nurses, teachers, they stagnated or fell.
So the labor share of the economy looks stable on a chart, but only because the top 10% of workers were essentially eating the lunch of the bottom 90%.
That's exactly what the data shows.
Mhm.
And one other quick difference. In the UK, their benefits wedge wasn't healthcare because they have the National Health Service. It was rising pension costs and national insurance contributions. So same mechanism, different specific cause.
It really shows how you have to dig into the details of the data. You can't just look at one GDP number and call it a day. Speaking of numbers, we have to talk about the Gini coefficient.
The standard metric for inequality. The Gini of 0 means everyone has the exact same income. A Gini of 1 means one person has absolutely everything.
And what happened to it in the 80s?
In the U.S., the Gini coefficient started a steep climb right at the beginning of the decade. The data shows it jumping from around 37.6 in 1986 to 38.2 by 1989, but that's just a snapshot. If you look at the full time series data starting from 1979, the slope of that line is practically a vertical wall. It was the sharpest increase in inequality since the Gilded Age.
And this brings us right to the political elephant in the room, trickle-down theory.
Reaganomics.
Reaganomics. The idea was, and I remember hearing this constantly growing up, if you cut taxes on the rich, they will take that extra money and they'll invest it. They'll build factories, they'll hire people, and that new wealth will trickle down to everybody else.
That was the narrative. The Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981, the Big Tax Reform Act of 1986, they were all sold to the public on this premise. Supply-side economics, they called it.
But the source material applies what it calls a second-order systemic reality here. So what actually happened? What did the system do?
Well, when the rich got more money via these huge tax cuts, they didn't, by and large, invest it in the real economy. They didn't build a ton of new factories in Ohio or Michigan.
So where did they put the money?
They saved it speculatively. It went into the stock market, fueling the bull run. It went into the bond market. It went into real estate assets. It stayed in the financial circuit, bidding up the price of existing assets. It didn't become wages for new jobs.
And for the poor, for the working class.
Since their wages were stagnant, as we've seen, they didn't get the trickle down. They got debt to maintain their standard of living, to keep up with the rising costs of housing and healthcare. They had to start borrowing.
So the rich got asset bubbles and the poor got credit card debt.
That is the simplified but devastatingly accurate summary of the decade's economic engine.
But hold on a second. For all of this to happen, for wages to stay flat while companies are making these huge profits, usually workers would fight back, right? That's what unions are for.
You'd think so.
You go on strike, you demand your share of the pie. If the company is making millions, the workers stop the assembly line until they get a raise. That's the whole point.
You've just hit on the absolute precondition for all of this. Wage suppression wasn't an accident, and it wasn't just a market outcome. It required a deliberate political project to break the bargaining power of labor. You cannot have the Great Decoupling if you still have strong unions.
Which brings us to Section 2 of our deep dive, the war on labor.
A war fought on two fronts.
And this was a transatlantic strategy again. It's striking how in sync Thatcher in the UK and Reagan in the US were. They seem to be reading from the exact same playbook.
It was systematic and ideological. In the UK, Thatcher famously viewed the powerful trade unions as the enemy within. That was her actual language. She saw them as an obstacle to her vision of a dynamic free market economy.
And the numbers show her campaign was effective.
Incredibly so. In 1979, union membership in the UK was at its absolute peak, 13.2 million people, a huge portion of the workforce. By the end of the 80s, it had plummeted. And this wasn't an accident. This was done through a series of very specific laws.
Like the Employment Acts.
The Employment Acts of 1980, 82, and 88, and the Trade Union Act of 1984. They did things like ban secondary action.
What's secondary action?
That's the key to solidarity. It means if the nurses go on strike, the bus drivers can't go on strike to support them. It isolates each union, forcing them to fight alone. They also made picketing much harder and required secret ballots for strike action, which sounds democratic, but was really designed to make it harder to organize.
And then the main event, the showdown, the miners' strike.
1984 to 85. This was a brutal, year-long, almost Civil War-like confrontation. Thatcher was prepared. She had secretly stockpiled coal for months in anticipation of the strike. She was ready to wait them out, no matter the cost to the country.
And this was more than just about coal, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Breaking the miners, the National Union of Mine Workers, wasn't just about energy prices or closing inefficient pits. It was about breaking the symbolic backbone of the entire British working class. The miners were seen as the strongest, most militant union.
And if they could be broken.
Then anyone could be. Once the miners were defeated, the signal was sent to every other union and every worker in the country. Resistance is futile.
And at the same time, over in the U.S., we had our own symbolic moment, maybe not as long and drawn out, but just as significant, the PATCO moment, 1981.
The Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization. What's so deeply ironic is that PATCO was actually one of the very few unions that had endorsed Ronald Reagan for president in 1980.
No way, really.
Yes. They thought, as a former union president himself, he'd be sympathetic. They thought he'd be pro-business, which would mean pro-growth for the airline industry and therefore for them. They went on strike for better safety conditions, a shorter work week, and better pay.
And Reagan's response?
It was absolute. He didn't just negotiate. He didn't just threaten. He went on television and gave them an ultimatum. Be back at work in 48 hours or you are fired.
And they weren't.
They weren't. They called his bluff. And he fired them, all of them, over 11,000 skilled federal workers. And then, for good measure, he banned them from federal service for life.
I've heard this described as the moment the psychological tide turned in corporate America. It was like a starting gun.
It was. Before PATCO, breaking a strike with scab labor hiring permanent replacement workers was seen as, a bit tacky. It was something you only did in the 19th century. It was socially unacceptable in the post-war era.
But Reagan made it acceptable.
He legitimized it. He sent a signal from the very top, from the White House to every private sector CEO in the country. It is now socially acceptable and politically protected to break strikes and replace your workforce. And the private sector listened. The number of strikes broken by permanent replacements skyrocketed after 1981.
So the result is obvious. Lower wages, less worker power. But the notes you have here point to a really interesting so what, a counterintuitive insight about what this did to business efficiency.
This is one of my favorite points in the entire body of research because it just completely challenges standard business thinking.
Yeah.
We usually think unions make companies inefficient.
Right. They demand high wages, they protect lazy workers, they resist new technology. That's the stereotype. Union bloat.
If you pay people too much, the business suffers. That's the logic. But what the source material argues is that you need to look at the systemic feedback loop. When labor is expensive, precisely because of strong unions, what does a smart company have an incentive to do?
Find a way to make that expensive labor more valuable.
Exactly. You invest in technology to make those workers more productive. You buy the expensive new robot arm because the guy lifting the box costs you $30 an hour. That pressure drives real innovation, real investment in capital goods, and genuine long-term productivity growth. It's the high road to capitalism.
But if you can smash the union and pay the guy $10 an hour...
You don't buy the robot, you just hire 3 cheap guys and run them into the ground. This is called the low road to capitalism. By crushing unions, companies were disincentivized from investing in labor-saving technology. Instead, they started competing by squeezing wages.
So paradoxically, the efficiency of the 80s, which was all about cutting labor costs, actually slowed down long-term productivity growth in many sectors.
Yes, because it removed the pressure to innovate. Why spend millions on R&D when you can just cut wages by 10%?
That is fascinating. So cheap labor is actually an addiction that kills innovation in the long run.
It encourages laziness and short-term thinking in management. Why innovate when you can just exploit? It's a short-term gain for the firm, but a long-term loss in the productive capacity of the entire economy.
So to recap where we are, we've got stagnant wages, broken unions, and a working class that's getting squeezed from all sides. But, and here's the puzzle, the 80s were a boom time for consumption. Malls were full, people were buying VCRs, microwaves, new cars.
The consumer society was in full swing.
If they didn't have the money in their paychecks, how on earth were they buying all this stuff?
And that is the perfect transition to Section 3, the financial turn. Or, as the source puts it, from service to master.
The service to master, I like that.
If you take away wage growth as the engine of demand, you have to replace it with something else to keep the economy moving. That something was credit.
This is where we get into the real plumbing of the banking system. And the outline here mentions something called Regulation Q. That sounds like a James Bond gadget.
It's far less exciting on the surface, but I promise you it's far more important. Regulation Q was a rule from the 1930s put in place after the Great Depression to stop reckless bank behavior that capped the interest rates banks could pay on deposits.
So it made banking boring.
It made banking incredibly boring and stable. You put your money in the bank, you got a small, predictable, fixed return. Banks didn't compete aggressively for your deposits. They were basically utilities that held money and made simple loans.
So what changed? Why get rid of it?
One word: inflation. In the 1970s, as you know, inflation hit double digits. If the bank is paying you 5% interest on your savings, but inflation is running at 12%, you are literally losing money by keeping it in the bank. Your purchasing power is melting away like an ice cream cone on the pavement.
So money started to flee the banking system.
In a torrent, people were desperately searching for better returns, anything that could beat inflation.
And the financial sector, innovative as always, was there to help.
They created a loophole, a brilliant system-altering loophole, the money market mutual fund, or MMF.
I have one of those. I had no idea it was an 80s invention.
It became an absolute behemoth in the 80s. These funds acted just like bank accounts. You could even write checks against them, but legally they weren't banks. They were investment pools.
And that distinction matters because?
Because they weren't insured by the government, the FDIC, and they weren't regulated like banks. They could invest in riskier, higher-yield assets and pass those returns on to depositors. This is the birth of what we now call shadow banking.
Shadow banking. It sounds ominous.
It just refers to any banking-like activities that happen outside the regulated safety net. And assets in these MMFs just exploded. They went from a few billion in the late 70s to hundreds of billions by the mid-80s. This tidal wave of money leaving traditional banks forced the government to finally repeal Regulation Q entirely, just to let normal banks compete.
But the genie was out of the bottle.
The genie of unregulated, high-yield, high-risk finance was out of the bottle and running the show.
And whenever you mix high risk with deregulation, things usually break. We have to talk about the savings and loan crisis. This feels like a chapter of history that's been kind of forgotten, but the notes here say it was huge.
It is a classic textbook case study in what happens next. The S&Ls were small, local banks. They were the Bailey Building and loan from It's a Wonderful Life.
Right, they take in local deposits and make local home mortgages.
And they had a huge structural problem. All their assets were old, 30-year mortgages paying out a low interest rate, maybe 6 or 7% from the 60s and 70s. But to survive in the high inflation 80s, they had to pay double-digit interest rates to attract depositors.
They were paying out more than they were taking in. They were technically bankrupt.
Massively so. The entire industry was insolvent. But instead of shutting them down and paying off the depositors, which would have been expensive, the government, specifically the Reagan administration, with the Garn-St. Germain Act of 1982, had a different idea.
Which was?
They said, let's deregulate them further. Let them invest in anything they want to try and make back the money. We'll raise the deposit insurance limit so people feel safe, and then we'll let them roll the dice.
The notes call this gambling for resurrection.
That is the technical term that economists use for it. And they gambled. With taxpayer-insured money, they bought junk bonds from Michael Milken. They invested in shady commercial real estate deals in the Sun Belt. They funded wind farms that didn't exist. It was an absolute carnival of fraud and incompetence.
And when the house of cards inevitably collapsed,
The taxpayers picked up the tab. A $160 billion bailout. It was the first major lesson for a generation in the core neoliberal principle of privatizing profits, socializing losses.
meaning
Meaning when the gamble pays off, The banker keeps the bonus and buys a yacht. When it fails, the public pays the bill.
And amidst all this chaos, we see the rise of what the notes call financial engineering, derivatives, securitization. These are words that became infamous in 2008, but you're saying they started here.
This is the laboratory. These are the tools that turn the economy from a place that makes things into a place that makes bets. Derivatives allowed you to bet on the movement of prices without ever owning the underlying thing. It molecularized risk, chopping it up and spreading it around the system in ways nobody could track.
And securitization.
That's the big one, specifically mortgage-backed securities, or MBS. This was the process of taking thousands of individual home loans, bundling them together into a new financial product, a bond, and then selling slices of that bond to investors.
Which, if I recall my 2008 history, is exactly what blew up the world.
The seeds were planted right here in the 1980s. But let's connect this all back to the worker we were talking about earlier, the guy whose wages are flat. Why does any of this financial plumbing matter to him?
Okay, yeah. Connect the dots.
Because securitization meant that banks were suddenly desperate to lend more money. In the old days, a bank held a mortgage for 30 years, so they were very careful about who they lent to. But now, they can make a loan, immediately bundle it up and sell it, getting the risk off their books entirely.
So they had an incentive to just churn out as many loans as possible, regardless of the quality.
Exactly. This unleashed a flood of credit cards, auto loans, and especially mortgages. Neoliberalism solved the problem of low wages by drowning the worker in debt.
It's a pretty dark fix when you put it like that. We won't pay you enough to live, but we'll be happy to lend you the money to live and charge you interest on it for the rest of your life.
And that interest becomes a brand new, massive revenue stream for the newly empowered financial sector. The snake eats its own tail. Okay, so we've looked at the domestic economy in the US and UK, but this was a global shift. Section 4 in our outline takes us to geopolitics, and specifically how this new economic model was exported, or maybe more accurately, enforced on the rest of the world.
And to understand that, we have to talk about the Volcker shock. Paul Volcker was the chairman of the U.S. Federal Reserve, appointed by Carter and kept on by Reagan. In 1979 through 1981, he made a decision to raise U.S. interest rates to unprecedented levels. At one point, the key rate was near 20% to kill the inflation that was plaguing the U.S. economy.
And it worked, right. By the mid-'80s, inflation was down.
In the United States, yes, it worked. But you have to remember, the U.S. dollar is the world's reserve currency. When you raise interest rates in New York, you cause a tsunami in the rest of the world.
Why is that?
Because the third world countries across Latin America and Africa had borrowed heavily in U.S. dollars during the 1970s to fund their development, to build roads, dams, and factories. When U.S. interest rates suddenly tripled, the interest payments on all those dollar-denominated loans also tripled. They were bankrupt overnight, through no fault of their own.
Completely. That started the debt crisis, which began with Mexico announcing it could no longer service its debt in August 1982. And this crisis is where the weaponization of debt really comes in. The IMF and the World Bank, controlled by the U.S. and its allies, stepped in not just to help, but to enforce a new model.
They saw an opportunity.
A huge one. They went to these desperate countries and said, we will bail you out, we will restructure your loans, but only if you sign this contract.
And the contract was the Structural Adjustment Program, the SAPs.
The pedagogy of debt, as one scholar calls it. The recipe was almost always the same. Regardless of the country's specific problems or culture, it had three main ingredients.
Okay, what were they?
1, austerity. You must cut subsidies for food and fuel for your own people. You must cut public sector jobs, fire teachers and doctors. 2, privatization. You must sell your state-owned assets, your water company, your telephone network, your mines, your oil fields, to foreign investors at fire sale prices.
And
3, trade liberalization. You must stop trying to build your own domestic industries. Just focus on exporting raw materials to the West. Open your markets to our goods, even if it wipes out your local farmers and businesses.
It really sounds like a looting operation disguised as economic policy.
The data strongly supports that view. During the 1980s, which is known as the lost decade in Latin America, these countries actually became net exporters of capital to the north.
Wait, say that again. They were sending more money out than they were getting.
Yes. They paid more in interest payments on their old debts than they received in new aid or investment. The poor were, in a very real sense, funding the rich.
Now, whenever you criticize this model, someone always brings up Chile. They say, look at the Chilean miracle. The Chicago boys went down there with Pinochet. They applied these pure free market principles. And look how rich Chile is today.
It is the favorite anecdote of the neoliberal apologist. It's held up as the proof of concept. But the source material does a forensic audit of what actually happened in the 80s in Chile under the Pinochet dictatorship. And the miracle looks much more like a disaster.
Okay, let's bust the myth. What do the actual numbers from the 80s say?
In 1982, after a few years of following this strict free market dogma, including fixing the exchange rate to the dollar, which was considered gospel, the Chilean economy completely imploded. GDP collapsed by 14% in a single year.
14%.
Yeah.
That's Great Depression territory.
It's worse. The U.S. Great Depression was a slow slide over several years. This was like driving off a cliff.
And unemployment?
Real unemployment, if you include the emergency work programs the dictatorship had to create, hit 30%. These were programs where men would get paid a pittance to basically dig ditches and fill them back in, just to keep people from starving and rioting.
And what about the crown jewel of the experiment, the privatized banking system?
And here's the ultimate irony. The private banking sector, the pride of the Chicago Boys experiment, collapsed completely under a mountain of bad debt. And what did the dictator Augusto Pinochet have to do to save it?
Don't tell me.
He had to nationalize the banks. The great free market dictatorship ended up owning more of the banking system than the socialist Allende government he overthrew.
That is just, it's unbelievable. So when people talk about the success of Chile, what are they actually looking at?
They are usually looking at the export numbers for things like copper and fruit, which did well for the elites who owned them.
Yeah.
Or, more often, they're looking at the period after 1990. The research shows that the poverty rate in Chile reached a staggering 50% in 1984. It was still at 34% in 1989. The real significant reduction in poverty only happened after democracy returned in the 90s and more balanced social policies were reintroduced.
So the 80s in Chile were a period of massive wealth transfer to the elite, maintained only by the torture chambers of the regime.
That's what the data suggests. It was a miracle for a very small group of people.
That's heavy stuff. But it shows that these economic theories don't operate in a vacuum. They have real, profound human costs. Which brings us to Section 5, biopolitics, rewiring the soul.
This is where we zoom in from the macro level of the global economy to the micro level of the individual person, from the bank to the brain. The source suggests that neoliberalism isn't just about money or markets, it's about creating a certain type of person, a certain type of soul.
And the outline for this section starts with the shift in the workplace from personnel to human resources. I have to admit, I always thought that was just corporate jargon rebranding, making it sound fancier.
It sounds like that, but words matter. Personnel management, the old term, implies administration. You manage a collective group of people, the staff. It acknowledges that they are a distinct group with their own interests and collective rights.
Okay, so what's different about human resource management?
Human resource management, or HRM, which completely took over in the 80s, changes the entire ontology of the worker.
How so?
It treats the worker not as a member of a class, labor, but as an individual resource to be mined, optimized, and aligned with the goals of the firm. The entire goal of HRM is to bypass the collective, to bypass the union, and speak directly to the individual's psychology.
The classic line, we're a family here.
Exactly. We're all on the same team.
Yeah.
But it's a family where you are constantly being evaluated, ranked, and pitted against your siblings. This is the era that gives us the rise of the individual performance review, individual bonuses, employee of the month.
So it breaks solidarity.
It atomizes the workforce. It tells the worker, your survival and success depend entirely on you, on your performance, on your attitude, not on your colleagues. It creates what the philosophers Foucault and Dardot and Laval call the entrepreneur of the self.
That phrase, entrepreneur of the self, it sounds so empowering on the surface, but when you think about it, it's actually exhausting. It means you are never off the clock. You are always marketing yourself, managing your own human capital.
And that leads directly to the psychological toll. The source material here cites the sociologist Christopher Lasch and his prophetic book from the late 70s, The Culture of Narcissism. He predicted the rise of the yuppie, the young urban professional.
The 80s icon.
Exactly. Obsessed with the self, with the body. Think of the aerobics craze, the gym culture, the obsession with brands, and with career status.
And Lasch's argument was that this wasn't happening because people were just selfish, right? It was a defense mechanism.
Precisely. Because the outside world, with the threat of nuclear war, economic crashes, the collapse of social institutions, it felt uncontrollable and terrifying. Lasch argued that this narcissism wasn't about loving yourself. It was a defensive shell. It was the minimal self, trying to survive in a hostile world by shutting out everything else and focusing on the one thing it could control, its own body and career.
And if you can't keep up, if you fail to be a successful entrepreneur of yourself,
You crash.
Hmm.
And this is why, according to the research, burnout explodes as a clinical and social phenomenon in the 1980s. Before, you were tired or exploited or oppressed. Now you are burnt out.
it's a different kind of language.
It implies you are a machine that has run out of fuel, a battery that has run dry. It internalizes the failure. It is the specific pathology of the neoliberal subject, the psychological collapse of the individual trying to constantly perform and optimize without any safety net.
And the notes also mention a much darker statistic, suicide.
Yes. The data from the UK and the US is quite disturbing, specifically for trends among young men in deindustrializing areas, the Rust Belt in the US, the north of England.
Why that group in particular?
Because when you tie a person's entire identity and sense of worth to their economic performance, to their role as a breadwinner, and then you take away the factories, you aren't just taking their job, you are taking their identity, their reason for being.
Right.
The suicide trends and the deaths of despair we talk about today have their roots right here in this rewiring of the soul.
It's tragic. We restructured the economy, but we didn't think about what that would do to the human psyche. And speaking of things we didn't think about, that brings us to the final section, section 6, the ecological cost, the Capitalocene.
This is the final and perhaps the most permanent debt that we incurred in the 1980s. There's a persistent myth that in the 80s, the West moved to a clean service economy. We stopped having smokestacks and started typing on computers.
The idea of dematerialization. The economy became weightless, all about information.
The source material calls this the myth of dematerialization. It's completely false. In reality, the 1980s is when we entered what scientists call the Great Acceleration of Environmental Impact. Global material extraction, the actual amount of stuff we dig out of the ground, grew from 35 billion tons in 1980 to 45 billion tons in 1990.
So we just moved the smokestacks somewhere else.
We moved them to the global south. Thanks to those structural adjustment programs opening up their economies and weakening their environmental laws, we outsourced the pollution. But the atmosphere, of course, is one single connected system.
And what was happening to the atmosphere?
We crossed the scientifically recognized safety threshold of 350 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere during this decade. We stepped over a line from which we've never returned.
The source here mentions the concept of the four cheaps. What are those?
It's a powerful concept from the sociologist Jason Moore. He argues that for capitalism to be highly profitable, it needs four things to be cheap, or even free: cheap food, cheap energy, cheap raw materials, and cheap labor.
Okay.
He argues that the crisis of the 1970s was a crisis of the four cheaps. They all got expensive at the same time. The 1980s, then, was a global strategy to find new frontiers and make them cheap again.
Ow. How did they do that?
By opening up the Amazon to logging and cattle ranching for cheap beef. By drilling for oil in more environmentally sensitive places. By forcing developing nations, through debt, to export food crops instead of feeding their own people. The cheap hamburger you bought in a U.S. fast food joint in 1989 was directly subsidized by the ecological exhaustion of the global south.
And politically, this was the era of the regulatory rollback. Reagan's attack on the Environmental Protection Agency.
It was a frontal assault. He appointed people to run the EPA, who literally hated the EPA. His first administrator, Ann Gorsuch, actively worked to defund and dismantle the agency. The goal was to subordinate all ecological concerns to the priority of short-term profit.
They were institutionalizing ecological debt.
Exactly. We took out a massive loan from the planet's future stability to pay for consumption in the present. We are paying the exorbitant interest on that debt today, with every hurricane, every wildfire, and every heat wave.
So we've covered the economy, labor finance, the globe, the mind, and the planet. That is a lot. As we start to wrap this up, how do we synthesize all of this? If we had to sum up the legacy of the 1980s in a single paragraph, what is it?
The expert analysis we reviewed proposes that we look at it as three shifts, three fundamental rewirings that define the neoliberal transition.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, a temporal shift. We solved the inflation crisis of the 1970s by creating the financial bubbles of the future. We traded consumer price inflation for asset price inflation. So we bought present stability at the price of guaranteed future instability.
Okay, that makes sense. We kicked the can down the road. What's the second shift?
A spatial shift. We solved the crisis of industrial profitability in the north by moving production and all its associated pollution to the south and the east. We solved a national problem by creating a massive global imbalance.
Then the third.
A social shift. We solved the problem of labor conflict and strikes by disintegrating the working class into a collection of atomized, indebted individuals who now saw themselves as consumers, not producers. We eliminated the class as a political actor, but massively increased the inequality between people.
That is an incredibly powerful framework. A temporal shift, a spatial shift, and a social shift. It really does feel like we're living in the house that the 80s built.
The windows are rattling, the foundation is cracking, and the roof is leaking badly. But yes, this is absolutely the house we all still live in.
So here is the final provocative thought for you listening. The source material suggests that the 80s installed an operating system, and that OS was designed for one thing and one thing only: short-term efficiency of capital accumulation.
And it was great at that, let's be clear. It generated a lot of wealth very quickly for a very specific group of people.
But it did this at the cost of long-term resilience, the resilience of our social systems and our ecological systems.
Exactly. It systematically stripped away all the buffers, the unions, the regulations, the financial controls, the ecological limits, all the things that protect the system from flying apart.
So the question for you to ponder is this. As we look around at today's polycrisis, the extreme inequality, the climate emergency, the recurring financial instability, we have to ask ourselves, are these bugs in the system? Are these unfortunate, unforeseen side effects?
Or are they the features? Are they the things we programmed directly into the source code exactly 40 years ago?
Did the machine break, or is it working exactly as it was designed to?
That's the question.
That's the question we leave you with. Thanks for diving deep with us today.
See you next time.